Sarah Johnson stood in front of the police station's front desk, her hands trembling as she clutched a folder filled with photographs and written accounts. The 32-year-old black woman had spent the last 3 weeks documenting every strange incident that made her feel unsafe in her own home. Today marked her first attempt to seek help from law enforcement, though something in her gut told her it wouldn't be easy. The desk sergeant, Officer Mike Peterson, barely looked up from his computer screen as Sarah tried to explain her situation. His fingers continued typing, the clicking of keys almost drowning out her voice as she described the mysterious car that had been following her home from work. "Someone has been parking outside my apartment building every night," Sarah explained, her voice steady despite her nerves. "They wait there for hours, and I've noticed the same person watching me when I leave for work in the morning." Officer Peterson finally glanced up, his expression a mixture of boredom and skepticism. "Ma'am, are you sure you're not just being paranoid? Downtown is a busy area. People park their cars everywhere." Sarah pulled out her phone, showing him the photos she'd taken. "It's the same car, same time, every night. I documented everything. Last night, they even tried to follow me into the parking garage, but I managed to lose them." The officer's response was quick and dismissive. "Look, unless this person has actually threatened you or done something illegal, there's not much we can do. Maybe you should consider moving to a safer neighborhood if you're feeling uncomfortable." The suggestion made Sarah's blood boil, but she maintained her composure. As a corporate attorney who had worked hard to afford her luxury apartment in the city's best area, she shouldn't have to move because the police wouldn't take her concerns seriously. "I'd like to file a formal report," Sarah insisted, pulling out more evidence from her folder. "I have dates, times, and the car's license plate number. Something isn't right, and I need help before this situation gets worse." Officer Peterson sighed heavily, as if Sarah was being an inconvenience. "Listen, Miss Johnson, we get dozens of similar complaints every week. Without concrete evidence of a crime, we can't waste resources on what might just be your imagination." Sarah watched as he pushed her folder back across the desk without even looking at its contents. Around them, other officers walked by, some throwing curious glances their way. She noticed how differently they treated the white woman who had come in earlier about a stolen bicycle. They had immediately taken her statement and assured her they would look into it. Feeling defeated but determined, Sarah gathered her documents. "Can you at least keep these photos on file, in case something does happen?" "You can call 911 if you feel you're in immediate danger," Officer Peterson replied, already turning his attention back to his computer screen. "Otherwise, I suggest you stop overthinking things. Maybe get some security cameras for your apartment if it makes you feel better." As Sarah walked out of the police station, the weight of frustration and fear pressed heavily on her shoulders. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and she found herself checking her surroundings more carefully than ever. The familiar sight of the suspicious dark sedan parked across the street made her heart race. In her car, Sarah sat for a moment, trying to steady her nerves. She hadn't wanted to do this, but she knew it was time to make a call. Pulling out her phone, she scrolled through her contacts until she found her father's number. William Johnson had always told her to handle her own battles, to prove she could stand on her own 2 feet. But after today's experience at the police station, she realized this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a system that needed to change. As she dialed his number, Sarah had no way of knowing that her father's involvement would not only solve her immediate problem, but would also spark a chain of events that would expose deep-rooted issues within the local police department. For now, she was simply a scared woman seeking help from the one person who had never let her down. Little did Officer Peterson know, his dismissive attitude toward Sarah Johnson would soon come back to haunt both him and the entire police department. The story that was about to unfold would shake the foundations of local law enforcement and force a long overdue conversation about racial bias in police response. After leaving the police station, Sarah spent the next 2 weeks living in constant fear. The stalking didn't just continue, it got worse. Every morning, she would find new reasons to be afraid, and every night, she documented everything with the precision of the lawyer she was. On Monday morning, Sarah discovered deep scratches on her car's driver's side door. By Wednesday, someone had tried to access her work email multiple times, triggering security alerts from her firm's department. The following weekend, her apartment's welcome mat was turned upside down when she returned from grocery shopping. a small detail that might mean nothing to others but scream danger to her. She returned to the police station 3 more times that week. Each visit left her more frustrated than the last. Different officers, same response. Nothing we can do. No real evidence of a crime. Maybe you're working too hard and seeing things. One young officer even had the audacity to suggest she was making up stories for attention. During her 4th visit, Sarah brought security footage from her apartment building. The grainy video clearly showed a tall figure in a dark hoodie lurking near her car at 3 a.m. The desk sergeant, a different one this time named Officer Roberts, barely glanced at the footage. "Look, Miss Johnson," Officer Roberts said, leaning back in his chair. "Even if someone was walking around the parking garage, that's not illegal. It's a public space." "Public space?" Sarah's voice rose slightly. "It's a private, secured garage that requires a key card for entry. This person shouldn't have been there." Officer Roberts shrugged, his badge catching the fluorescent light as he shifted. "Maybe they're a resident. Maybe they were visiting someone. We can't arrest people for walking around." As Sarah left the station once again, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The mysterious dark sedan was parked right across from the police station. The driver was watching her, not even trying to hide anymore. Sarah quickly snapped several photos with her phone, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. That evening, while preparing dinner in her apartment, Sarah heard an unusual sound from her balcony. Living on the 12th floor should have made her feel safe, but when she saw a shadow move across her curtains, panic seized her chest. She immediately called 911. 911, what's your emergency? "Someone is on my balcony," Sarah whispered, crouching behind her kitchen counter. "I live on the 12th floor of the Madison Building downtown. Please hurry." "Ma'am, are you sure it's not just the wind?" Sarah wanted to scream. "I can see their shadow. Please send someone now." The operator's voice remained frustratingly calm. "Units will be dispatched when available." 23 minutes. That's how long Sarah waited, pressed against her kitchen cabinets, watching the shadow pace back and forth on her balcony. When the police finally arrived, the intruder was long gone, leaving only footprints on the balcony's dusty floor and a bent screen on the sliding door. Officer Jenkins, who responded to the call, seemed more interested in Sarah's view of the city than the evidence of attempted break-in. "Nice place you got here," he commented, whistling at the downtown skyline. "Must cost a pretty penny." "Officer, someone tried to break in," Sarah said, pointing to the damaged screen. "They were standing right here. Look at these footprints." "Could have been the maintenance crew," Jenkins suggested, not bothering to take photos or notes. "They access balconies for window cleaning sometimes." "At 9 p.m.? Sarah's voice cracked with disbelief. "Without notifying residents?" Jenkins gave her his card, the same way someone might hand out a business card at a networking event. "Call us if anything else happens," he said, already heading for the door. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat in her living room with all the lights on, her father's number pulled up on her phone. She'd been trying to handle this situation on her own, wanting to prove she could solve her own problems. But now, watching the same dark sedan cruise past her building for the 3rd time that night, she realized she was out of options. With hands that had finally stopped shaking, perhaps from resignation rather than calm, she pressed the call button. As the phone rang, Sarah looked at the growing file of evidence on her coffee table. Photos, videos, timestamps, witness statements from her doorman, everything that the police had dismissed. She didn't know it yet, but her father's response to this situation would change everything, not just for her, but for the entire city's police department. The night everything changed started like any other in Sarah's 2 weeks of terror. She had just finished a late conference call with clients in London, and the clock on her laptop showed 11:43 p.m. The familiar heaviness of fear settled in her stomach as she heard a car engine idle outside her building, knowing without looking that it would be the dark sedan. Sarah had developed new habits since the stalking began. She triple-checked her locks, kept pepper spray in every room, and had installed additional security cameras that connected to her phone. Her firm had offered to let her work from home, but she refused to let fear completely control her life. That night, she followed her new security routine, checking the balcony door, testing the window locks, and ensuring her phone was fully charged. Just as she was about to head to bed, she heard something that made her freeze. the distinct sound of someone trying to pick her front door lock. Sarah's hands trembled as she grabbed her phone and silently moved to her bedroom. The sound continued, metal scratching against metal, the slight jiggling of her doorknob. She dialed 911 while hiding in her walk-in closet, her free hand clutching the pepper spray. 911, what's your emergency? Someone is trying to break into my apartment, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. 12th floor, the Madison Building, Unit 1202. Please hurry, I can hear them at my door. Is there another way out of your apartment? The dispatcher asked. No, just the front door and the balcony, Sarah replied, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear herself speak. I've been reporting a stalker for weeks, but the police wouldn't help. Units are responding, the dispatcher said. Please stay on the line. The next few minutes felt like hours. Sarah heard the terrible sound of her lock finally giving way, followed by footsteps in her living room. Through the gap under her closet door, she could see a flashlight beam sweeping across her bedroom floor. They're inside, she breathed into the phone. Please hurry. Police are 4 minutes out, the dispatcher responded. The footsteps grew closer to her bedroom. Sarah held her breath, pressing herself against the back wall of her closet, behind her hanging clothes. The beam of light entered her bedroom, methodically searching every corner. Just as the closet door began to creak open, multiple sirens blared from the street below. The intruder's flashlight switched off immediately, and Sarah heard rapid footsteps retreating through her apartment. The front door slammed shut. It took the police 12 minutes to reach her floor after arriving at the building. When they finally entered her apartment, Sarah was still huddled in her closet, clutching her phone with white knuckles. Ma'am, an officer called out. This is the police. Are you here? Sarah emerged shakily from the closet. 2 officers stood in her living room. Officer Jenkins, who had dismissed her balcony incident days earlier, and a younger officer she hadn't met before. The door was open when we arrived, Jenkins noted, shining his flashlight at her broken lock. But no sign of forced entry. No sign? Sarah's voice rose in disbelief. The lock is literally broken. Look at the scratch marks around it. The younger officer at least had the decency to take photos of the damage, but Jenkins seemed more interested in wrapping up quickly. Could have been damage from normal wear and tear, he suggested. These old buildings? This is a brand new luxury building. Sarah cut in, her fear giving way to anger. And I have security camera footage of someone picking my lock. She pulled out her phone, showing them the crystal clear video from the camera she'd installed above her door. The footage showed a tall figure in dark clothing working on her lock for several minutes before breaking in. Jenkins glanced at the video briefly. We'll include it in the report, he said, though he hadn't written anything down since arriving. You might want to stay with friends tonight until you can get that lock fixed. As the officers prepared to leave, Sarah noticed something they had missed, a small piece of paper that had fallen near her front door. She waited until they left before picking it up. It was a receipt from a hardware store dated that morning, listing items that made her blood run cold. Lockpicks, duct tape, and zip ties. That night, as Sarah packed an overnight bag to stay at a hotel, she made a decision. She waited long enough. Tomorrow morning, she would tell her father everything. What she didn't know was that Judge William Johnson's response would shake the entire police department to its core. Judge William Johnson sat in his home office, his weathered hands gripping the armrests of his leather chair as he listened to his daughter recount the past few weeks. The morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the walls lined with law books and civil rights awards from his 30 years on the federal bench. Sarah sat across from him, exhausted after a sleepless night in the hotel. She spread out her evidence on his desk. Photographs, security footage, the hardware store receipt, and detailed logs of every police interaction. William's face grew darker with each new detail she shared. And this is the 4th time you've gone to the police? He asked, his deep voice controlled but carrying an edge of anger she rarely heard. 5th, actually, Sarah corrected, pulling out her documented timeline. The first time, they said I was being paranoid. The second time, they suggested I move to a safer neighborhood. Last night, they acted like a broken lock was normal wear and tear. William stood up slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the city he'd served for decades. As a judge, He'd worked tirelessly to reform the justice system, but seeing his own daughter failed by that same system hit differently. "Did any of these officers take your statement?" he asked, still facing the window. "File a report. Follow up on the license plate number?" Sarah shook her head. "Nothing. Officer Jenkins actually yawned while I was showing him the security footage from last night." William turned back to his desk, picking up the hardware store receipt. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from anger. "Lockpicks, duct tape, and zip ties," he read aloud. "And they still wouldn't help. They said without proof that the receipt belonged to the stalker. It wasn't evidence." Sarah's voice cracked. "Dad, I don't know what to do anymore. I'm scared to go home." William sat back down, studying the police business cards Sarah had collected. Each one represented an officer who had failed his daughter. He recognized some of the names: young officers who had testified in his courtroom, departments he had pushed to reform. "Give me an hour," he said finally, reaching for his phone. "Don't leave the house." Sarah knew that tone. It was the same one he'd used when arguing landmark cases, when facing down systemic injustice. She watched as he pulled out his old address book, not a phone contact list, but actual leather-bound book filled with decades of connections. His first call was to the current district attorney, James Morrison, who had once been his law clerk. "Jim, Bill Johnson here. We need to talk about a situation at the downtown precinct." Next came calls to the police commissioner, the mayor's office, and several prominent civil rights attorneys. With each call, William's voice grew firmer, his purpose clearer. He didn't just detail Sarah's case, he systematically outlined every failure, every dismissal, every moment of negligence. Between calls, he studied Sarah's evidence more carefully. "The car's license plate," he said suddenly. "Have you run it through the public database?" Sarah nodded. "It's registered to a Robert Myers. The name seemed familiar, so I checked. He was a client at my firm last year. We won a case against him for workplace harassment." William's expression hardened. He made one more call, this time to Judge Maria Rodriguez, who presided over family court cases. "Maria, I need everything you have on a Robert Myers." "Yes, it's urgent." As her father worked, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. She watched him transform from her concerned father into the formidable Judge Johnson, a man who had helped desegregate schools in the 1990s and had written opinions that changed state law. An hour later, William put down his phone for the last time. "The police chief will be calling you within the hour," he told Sarah. "A detective has already been assigned to your case. A good one, Karen Martinez. She handled several major cases in my court." He paused, looking at his daughter with a mixture of love and regret. "I'm sorry you had to go through this alone for so long, but I promise you, things are going to change, not just for you, but for every person those officers ignored." Sarah hugged her father, feeling safe for the first time in weeks. What she didn't know was that Judge William Johnson had set in motion events that would expose not just one case of negligence, but a pattern of discrimination that would rock the entire police department. As father and daughter waited for the police chief's call, William organized Sarah's evidence into the kind of presentation that had won him countless cases. This time, he wasn't fighting for justice in a courtroom, he was fighting for his daughter's life, and he intended to win. Police Chief Richard Anderson's Monday morning started with an avalanche of phone calls. By 9:15 a.m., his secretary had interrupted his morning coffee 3 times with increasingly urgent messages. The mayor's office, the district attorney. Anderson sat at his desk, reviewing the hastily gathered reports, or rather, the lack of them. 5 visits to the station, multiple attempts to file complaints, and clear evidence of stalking and breaking and entering. Yet his officers had filed nothing but basic incident notes, most dismissing her concerns entirely. "Get me Officer Jenkins and Peterson in here now," he barked into his intercom. Then, looking at the name that had made his blood run cold, "And find out why nobody realized she was Judge William Johnson's daughter." Across town, Detective Karen Martinez was already at Sarah's apartment, conducting the kind of investigation that should have happened weeks ago. She photographed the damaged lock, collected the hardware store receipt for fingerprint analysis, and downloaded all of Sarah's security footage. "This should have been handled immediately," Martinez said, shaking her head as she reviewed Sarah's detailed documentation. You get everything right, Ms. Johnson. The system failed you. Back at the police station, Officers Jenkins and Peterson sat uncomfortably in Chief Anderson's office, facing not just their boss but also two internal affairs investigators who had appeared that morning. Would either of you care to explain, Anderson asked, his voice dangerously quiet, why a woman with clear evidence of stalking was turned away 5 times? Jenkins shifted in his chair. Sir, we get dozens of similar complaints. Similar to this. Anderson slammed a folder on his desk. Security footage of someone picking a lock, a documented pattern of surveillance, a suspect with a history of harassment charges. Please, tell me about all these similar cases you've ignored. Before either officer could respond, Anderson's phone rang again. This time, it was Judge Johnson himself. Your Honor, Anderson answered, watching his officers pale at the realization of whose call he was taking. Yes, I'm handling this personally now. Detective Martinez is all ready. Yes, I understand the seriousness. No, sir, this will never happen again. After hanging up, Anderson turned back to his officers. Both of you are suspended pending investigation. Internal Affairs will review every complaint you've handled in the past year. If we find a pattern of discriminatory response, you'll be looking for new careers. Across the city, the story was spreading through legal circles. Judge Johnson hadn't just called in favors, he'd exposed a systemic problem. Law firms were reviewing cases where clients' complaints had been ignored. Civil rights organizations were gathering data on response times in different neighborhoods. By afternoon, Sarah received another visitor at her apartment, Assistant District Attorney James Morrison, who had worked as Judge Johnson's clerk years ago. We're charging Robert Myers with stalking, attempted breaking and entering, and criminal harassment, Morrison explained, reviewing the case files Martinez had already compiled. His previous harassment charge makes this a felony. Judge Rodriguez found 3 other restraining orders against him that he violated. Sarah sat in her living room, watching as her case transformed from an ignored complaint to a priority investigation in less than 12 hours. The dark sedan was gone from its usual spot, replaced by a patrol car with 2 officers who actually paid attention to their surroundings. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. Meeting with police commissioner tomorrow. This isn't just about you anymore. Change is coming. That evening, watching the local news, Sarah saw Chief Anderson giving a press conference. He announced a department-wide review of complaint procedures, new training protocols, and an external audit of response patterns across different neighborhoods. Recent events have brought to light unacceptable failures in our duty to protect and serve AL citizens, Anderson stated, looking uncomfortable but determined. We are implementing immediate changes to ensure every complaint is taken seriously, regardless of who makes it. What he didn't say, but everyone knew, was that it took a judge's daughter being ignored to expose what countless other citizens had experienced. Sarah watched the press conference with mixed feelings, grateful for the protection she now had, but angry that it took her father's influence to get it. As night fell, for the first time in weeks, Sarah slept in her own apartment, knowing that real police officers were finally watching out for her. But her last thought before drifting off wasn't about her own safety. It was about all the other women who didn't have a federal judge for a father, and how their stories needed to be heard too. Detective Karen Martinez worked with the kind of efficiency that made other officers nervous. Early Tuesday morning, Martinez sat in her office, surrounded by evidence boards and computer screens. The hardware store receipt had yielded clear fingerprints matching Robert Myers. Security footage from the store showed him purchasing the lockpicks and other items. His credit card records revealed more disturbing purchases, a high-powered camera, tracking devices, and various surveillance equipment. Got you, Martinez muttered, printing another search warrant. She'd already conducted a preliminary search of Myers' apartment, finding detailed notes about Sarah's daily routine, photographs covering his walls, and even copies of her apartment's floor plans. At 10 a.m., Martinez called Sarah to her office. Sarah arrived with her father, Judge Johnson, who had insisted on being present for any major case developments. We've identified your stalker, Martinez began, pulling up Myers' file on her computer. Robert Myers, age 45. You represented his former employer in a harassment case last year? Sarah nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He lost his job and had to pay damages to several women he'd harassed at work. Well, he's been busy since then, Martinez continued, spreading photographs across her desk. We found evidence that he's been stalking you for at least 3 months, not just the recent weeks you noticed. He had a detailed surveillance system set up in the building across from yours. Judge Johnson leaned forward, examining the photos. What kind of charges are we looking at? Martinez pulled out a thick file. Multiple felony counts, aggravated stalking, attempted breaking and entering, criminal harassment, illegal surveillance, and possession of burglary tools. Given his previous conviction and the level of planning involved, he's looking at serious prison time. As they discussed the case, Martinez's phone buzzed. A text from her surveillance team confirmed that Myers had just been spotted entering his usual coffee shop. Everything was in place. "Excuse me," Martinez said, standing up. "It's time to make an arrest." Sarah and her father watched through the office window as Martinez gathered her team. Within minutes, 5 police cars silently pulled away from the station, their lights off to avoid alerting their target. At the coffee shop, Robert Myers sat at his usual table, unaware that his world was about to collapse. He was reviewing photos on his laptop, more surveillance images of Sarah, when Martinez's team entered. "Robert Myers," Martinez announced, her badge clearly visible. "You're under arrest." Myers tried to run, but officers had already covered all exits. As Martinez read him his rights, other officers seized his laptop and phone as evidence. The arrest was clean, professional, and witnessed by dozens of morning coffee customers who immediately started posting about it on social media. Back at the station, Sarah watched Myers being led to booking in handcuffs. He looked smaller than she remembered, less threatening now that he was the one being watched. "We'll need you to review some evidence," Martinez told Sarah gently. "Take breaks whenever you need them. This might be difficult to see." For the next 2 hours, Sarah identified dates and locations in Myers' surveillance photos. Each image confirmed his obsession and helped strengthen the case against him. Judge Johnson stayed by her side, his presence both comforting and a reminder of why this investigation had finally happened. By evening, the case had grown even larger. Martinez's team discovered connections between Myers and 2 other unsolved stalking cases in the city. Women who had been ignored by the police, just as Sarah had been, were finally getting justice. The district attorney is fast-tracking this case, Martinez informed them as they prepared to leave. "Given the evidence we have, Myers will likely accept a plea deal rather than face trial. Either way, he's going away for a long time." As Sarah and her father left the station, they passed Officers Jenkins and Peterson clearing out their desks, their suspensions now extended pending further investigation. Neither officer would meet their eyes. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling truly safe for the first time in months. Her father squeezed her shoulder gently. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Sarah nodded, knowing that home would feel different now. The dark sedan wouldn't be waiting outside her building anymore. The footsteps in the hallway wouldn't make her heart race. Thanks to one dedicated detective who actually listened, her nightmare was finally over. But as they drove away, Sarah couldn't help wondering about other women still waiting for someone to take their fears seriously. Her case was solved, but the bigger fight for equal justice was just beginning. The media storm hit with unexpected force. What started as a local news story about a stalking arrest quickly evolved into something much bigger. "We've received over 50 emails since this morning," said Regina Torres, a local news reporter who had taken particular interest in the case. All from women with similar stories, police dismissing their complaints, refusing to file reports, telling them they were being paranoid. The contrast in police response before and after learning Sarah's connection to Judge Johnson became the focal point of a larger investigation. Channel 5 obtained body camera footage showing Officer Jenkins' dismissive attitude during Sarah's previous complaints, compared with the department's sudden urgency once her father's identity was known. Local newspapers began digging deeper. The City Tribune's investigation revealed disturbing statistics. Complaints from women of color were 3 times more likely to be dismissed or left uninvestigated compared to other reports. Response times varied dramatically between neighborhoods, with wealthy areas receiving priority attention. Sarah sat in her living room, reading through messages from other women who had reached out to share their stories. One particularly haunting email came from Maria Rodriguez, a restaurant worker who had reported a stalker 6 months ago and was still waiting for police action. "Your case is important," Judge Johnson told his daughter over dinner one evening. "Not because of who you are, but because it exposed what happens to those who don't have influence." The police department faced mounting pressure. Chief Anderson called a press conference to address the growing controversy. Standing before a wall of microphones, he announced sweeping changes to departmental policies. "We are implementing mandatory response protocols for all stalking and harassment complaints," Anderson declared. "Every report will be logged, investigated, and followed up on, regardless of who files it. We're also introducing new training programs and oversight measures to ensure equal treatment for all citizens." But the real change came from unexpected quarters. Sarah's case had caught the attention of state legislators. State Senator Michelle Chen, who had been pushing for police reform for years, saw an opportunity. "What happened to Sarah Johnson happens every day to women who don't have powerful fathers," Chen stated during a legislative session. "It's time to codify proper response procedures into law." The proposed legislation, quickly dubbed Sarah's Law, would require police departments across the state to follow strict protocols when handling stalking and harassment complaints. It mandated thorough documentation, specified response times, and created oversight committees to review cases that were dismissed without investigation. Meanwhile, Detective Martinez's success with Sarah's case led to the creation of a specialized unit focusing on stalking and harassment cases. The unit, staffed by carefully selected officers, began reviewing hundreds of previously dismissed complaints. Sarah found herself increasingly involved in advocacy work. Her law firm allowed her to dedicate pro bono hours to helping other stalking victims navigate the legal system. She worked with women's organizations to create educational materials about documenting harassment and knowing your rights. The internal affairs investigation into Officers Jenkins and Peterson revealed a disturbing pattern of discriminatory behavior. Both officers were ultimately terminated, and their previous cases were reopened for review. Local media continued following the story's developments. One evening, Sarah watched a news segment featuring interviews with other stalking victims whose cases had been ignored. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar to hers, but they hadn't had a federal judge to intervene on their behalf. "The system shouldn't require connections to work properly," Sarah told a reporter who asked for her comment. "Every person deserves to be heard, to be protected, to be taken seriously when they ask for help." As autumn turned to winter, Sarah's case became a catalyst for change. Police departments in neighboring cities began voluntarily adopting the protocols proposed in Sarah's Law. Civil rights organizations used her story to highlight broader issues of systemic bias in law enforcement. Judge Johnson watched these developments with mixed emotions, proud of the changes being made but pained that it took his daughter's trauma to spark them. During a private moment in his chambers, he pulled out an old photograph of Sarah as a little girl, remembering how he had always taught her to fight for what was right. Now she was fighting not just for herself, but for every woman who had ever stood at a police desk, asking for help and being turned away. The story wasn't over, but the ending was beginning to look more like justice. 6 months after Robert Meyer's arrest, Sarah Johnson stood at a podium in the state capitol building, facing a room packed with lawmakers, activists, and media. Behind her sat her father, Judge William Johnson, alongside Detective Martinez and dozens of women who had come forward with their own stories of ignored complaints. "Today, we're not just changing a law," Sarah began, her voice steady. "We're changing a system that failed not just me, but countless others. Sarah's Law isn't about Sarah Johnson. It's about every person who ever asked for help and was turned away." The legislation had grown far beyond its original scope. What started as a protocol for handling stalking cases had evolved into a comprehensive reform package. It now included mandatory training for officers, establishment of specialized units in every major precinct, and creation of an independent oversight board to review dismissed complaints. Robert Myers had accepted a plea deal 3 months earlier, receiving a 15-year sentence, but his case had opened the floodgates. Detective Martinez's specialized unit had solved 37 previously dismissed stalking cases in half a year. Each success story added momentum to the reform movement. In the police department, changes were already visible. Chief Anderson had replaced the old guard with officers who understood the importance of taking every complaint seriously. The department's response times had equalized across neighborhoods, and complaint dismissal rates had dropped dramatically. Sarah's law firm had created a new division dedicated to helping stalking victims navigate the legal system. They offered free consultations every Wednesday, and the waiting room was always full. Sarah made a point of meeting with each client personally, sharing her story and listening to theirs. Officer Jenkins and Peterson's termination had led to a broader internal investigation. 12 other officers were suspended or resigned. The department's old culture of dismissiveness was being systematically dismantled, replaced by one of accountability and equal treatment. During the signing ceremony for Sarah's law, an unexpected guest approached the podium. Maria Rodriguez, the restaurant worker whose ignored complaints had haunted Sarah months ago. Because of these changes, Maria said, tears in her eyes, my stalker was finally arrested last week. The new protocols meant my complaint couldn't be ignored anymore. My children can sleep safely now. Judge Johnson watched from his seat, remembering the night his daughter had finally called him for help. The changes sparked by that call had exceeded anything he'd achieved in 30 years on the bench. Sometimes, he realized, justice needed a personal face to drive institutional change. Detective Martinez's specialized unit became a model for other cities. She traveled around the state, training other departments in the new protocols. Her team's success rate made headlines, and her methods were being studied by police academies nationwide. The old police station where Sarah had been dismissed so many times had undergone its own transformation. The front desk now displayed a large poster outlining victims' rights and reporting procedures. Every complaint was logged electronically, preventing cases from disappearing into forgotten files. Sarah's own life had found a new normal. The trauma of those terrifying weeks hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something purposeful. She still checked her surroundings out of habit, but now she did it with confidence rather than fear. As the governor signed Sarah's law into effect, the room erupted in applause. Sarah felt her father's hand on her shoulder, saw Detective Martinez's proud smile, and heard the cheers of women who would never again be told their fears didn't matter. Later that evening, Sarah visited her old apartment building. The new security systems installed after her case had become standard features in buildings across the city. The dark sedan that had once terrorized her had been replaced by regular patrol cars, their presence now reassuring rather than indifferent. Standing in the lobby, Sarah remembered the frightened woman who had first approached the police desk months ago. She wished she could tell that version of herself that her story would help change things for others, that her fear would transform into purpose, her trauma into triumph. As she left the building, Sarah passed a young woman entering. Their eyes met briefly, and Sarah saw recognition flash across the woman's face. But it wasn't the recognition of seeing a judge's daughter or a news story subject. It was the recognition of seeing someone who had fought for change and won. The story that began with police refusing to help a black woman had ended by helping countless others. Sarah's law would ensure that no one's cry for help would go unheard again, regardless of who their father was.